I'm tackling a question that was done by Group 4, and it is stated, why did the US invade Iraq, but failed to invade North Korea? So, the discussion starts with the 9/11 attack. So after 9/11 attack, there were a lot of speculations that Iraq was behind it. There were a lot of speculations that the then president of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, was working in collaboration with Al-Qaeda, and he played a pivotal role in that attack. By that time, North Korea also was posing a security threat to the United States. So I would beseech each and every member to familiarize themselves with the position or the location of North Korea on the global map. North Korea is neighboring South Korea, which is a close ally of the US, and it is also neighboring Japan. So the two, Japan and South Korea, are allies of the US. So from early 90s, there were a group of three countries, that is Iraq, North Korea, and Iran, that had emerged as the greatest threat to the United States. That was after the fall of Soviet Union. These three countries were the greatest threat to the United States. So I want to give a brief background so that I can go into the summary as fast as I can. The three countries were labeled as an axis of evil by President Bush. Why? Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, was accused of having weapons of mass destruction. North Korea, under Kim Jong-un, was accused of having intercontinental ballistic missiles. Then Iran, under the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, was accused of sponsoring international terrorism. So those are the reasons as to why these three countries were grouped together and termed as an axis of evil. Iran was out of the equation after the 9/11 attack. Now the blame fell on Iraq and North Korea. Now we want to see why the US decided to invade Iraq but failed to invade North Korea. Before I go into that, I want to give you some key background information about the two countries. Firstly, we know that Iraq is located in the Middle East, while North Korea is in East Asia. Iraq, before the invasion, Iraq had about 400,000 troops, while North Korea had about 1 million troops. So I want you to do that comparison. North Korea has 1 million, Iraq has 400,000. Iraq did not have intercontinental ballistic missiles. Those are long-range missiles that had the potential of destroying US cities, while North Korea had 3 intercontinental ballistic missiles that could hit the US mainland, particularly there is a territory known as Guam. So North Korea had those weapons. The other thing, Iraq is neighboring Iran, and most of her neighbors are not allies of the United States, while North Korea is closer to South Korea, and the capital city of the South Korea is Seoul, and Seoul acts as the command center of the US military operations in the East Asia, and also Seoul is the home of about 25% of South Korean population. Now, before I go into the details, I just want to pose a simple question. We've already said that North Korea had 1 million soldiers, Iraq had 400. North Korea is closer to US allies, Iraq is not closer to any US allies. Before I continue, Sally, which of the two countries posed the greatest threat to the United States? No, I have already given a brief comparison. Out of the two, which one posed the greatest threat to the United States national security? Iraq. Okay.
North Korea.
So, sorry, it is North Korea that posed the greatest threat, because you can see it had a huge military. It had 3 intercontinental ballistic missiles, and then it is closer to US allies, particularly the US military command. So North Korea posed the greatest threat to the United States compared to Iraq. But now, how come Iraq was attacked and North Korea was not attacked? There are two theories that are trying to explain why there was that variation in the action that the US government undertook. The first theory is constructivism, and the second theory is realism. Constructivism, just to talk about it briefly, is all about construction of ideas and identities. And this means there are countries that if they possess a nuclear weapon, they will become a danger to the international system compared to others. For example, the United States has over 700 nuclear warheads. Well, Iraq did not have, but if Iraq accumulate one nuclear weapon, it becomes a threat. That is a construction of an idea. Another example, but this is a local example, is what Senator Mithika Linturi is facing at the moment. There are those people who are saying that he was misquoted. So it is all about constructing an idea, and then you advance that idea, it becomes true in certain quarters, and then in other quarters it becomes false. Therefore, the US constructed Iraq as a rogue state that was bent on destabilizing the hegemony of the US. So that is one of the theories that is trying to explain why Iraq will be attacked. So the US government constructed Iraq as an aggressive state that was bent on destroying America. Compared to North Korea, in 1994 there was an agreement between the US and North Korea, and this agreement was referred to as Agreed Framework. And this framework stipulated that United States, North Korea, and South Korea would pursue diplomacy in case of a conflict. So they ruled out any chance of military action. The other thing is that agreement stipulated that North Korea and South Korea will refrain from military conflict. And also lastly, the framework stated that the US would refrain from forcibly reuniting the country because the country was one in before 1950. Now, that is the agreement that existed between the US and North Korea, that in case of a conflict, they would utilize diplomacy. But between the US and Iraq, the only agreement that existed was that of a military action. And that one we can understand it from the year 1991. We all know that Iraq had invaded Iran in the year 1980, and they fought that war up to 1988. By that time, Iraq was being supported by the US. But now in 1990 to 1991, Iraq invaded Kuwait. So at that particular time, the US supported Kuwait and expelled Iraq out of Kuwait. So from that point, from 1991 going forward, there was a change in US policy in regards to Iraq. So the only agreement that existed was informal agreement of military intervention. In case of a conflict, there will be a military intervention, as the US intervened in 1990. So we have to take this one seriously. There was no provision of diplomacy or negotiation between the US and Iraq. That is constructivism. According to realism, we all know that realism talks about how states pursue power in order to survive in the international system. Therefore, North Korea having 3 intercontinental ballistic missiles was interpreted in the US as an act of defense. So they were accumulating those weapons to survive. But When it comes to Iraq, the US accused Iraq of destabilizing the international order, trying to upset the balance of power. In other words, Iraq was trying to outflank the US as the hegemon in the Middle East. So that is realism. The other reason that realism explains is that we all know that in that 1980 to 1988 Iraq-Iran war, Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons. And also before that, Saddam Hussein had also used chemical and poisonous gas to fight a certain ethnic group known as Kurds. We have all heard about Kurds because they were opposing his regime. So Saddam Hussein had a track record of abusing weapons. So the US assumed that if Saddam Hussein possesses weapons of mass destruction or nuclear weapons, there is a likelihood that he will use them to attack the US. But they exonerated North Korea that they are pursuing those weapons to survive in the international system. Now, why did the US invade Iraq in 2003? One of the reasons is the United sought a regime change in Baghdad. Saddam Hussein had become stronger and stronger, and he was reshaping the politics of the Middle East. We all know that the US has a lot of interest in the Middle East because of the oil resource. So Saddam Hussein had become too powerful to an extent that he was dictating the international price for barrels of oil. Therefore, the US, being the largest consumer of oil globally, wanted to get rid of Saddam Hussein, install a friendly regime so that they can continue enjoying the oil resource. So that is one of the reasons as to why the US invaded Iraq. And also to add on that, the US between 1991 to 2003, when Iraq was invaded, there is a span of about 11 years. In 1991, Bush Sr. was the president of the United States. He was advised to get rid of Saddam Hussein as early as 1990s, but he refrained from getting rid of Saddam Hussein and instead embraced a containment policy. He imposed sanctions on Saddam Hussein, but after the imposition of sanctions, Saddam Hussein became stronger. He was able to solidify the Iraqis to support him. So he accumulated a lot of power to an extent that he had become a threat. Therefore, the US realized that the containment policy would no longer work to checkmate Saddam Hussein. Therefore, they resorted to military intervention, and that explains why they had to invade Iraq. The second reason is that the Bush administration, now the Bush 2, the Bush 40, George W. Bush, who ruled between 2000 and 2008, he argued that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11 attack. We all know that the 9/11 attack was perpetrated by Al-Qaeda, and Osama bin Laden was the leader of Al-Qaeda. Now, Bush administration constructed a narrative that Saddam Hussein was sponsoring Al-Qaeda. Therefore, for the US to fight terrorism effectively, they had to fight Saddam Hussein, get him out of power, disarm Iraq of weapons of mass destruction, and in doing so, they would decapitate non-state actors, particularly terrorist group. So the second reason was to get Saddam Hussein out of power because of the perceived links with terrorist groups, particularly the Al-Qaeda. The third reason was Iraq was a model of tyrannical regime. So we all know that Saddam Hussein had accumulated or consolidated a lot of political power in the Middle East to an extent that he was a strong man in that region. Now, the Bush cabinet was constituted of two ideological camps. They were neoconservatives and they were realists. Now, neoconservatives were stronger than realists, and they advocated, this is one of their ideological disposition. They advocate for moral clarity between good and evil. And in their definition, good is represented by a liberal democracy, while evil is represented by a despotic or a tyrannical regime. Now, between the US and Iraq, US is an embodiment of democracy, while Iraq was an embodiment of dictatorship. Therefore, they labeled Iraq as evil, and therefore they had to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Further, they compared Saddam Hussein to Hitler, and because of that demonization, we all know the memories that Hitler evokes in the minds of the people. Therefore, they had to get rid of Saddam Hussein because of his tyrannical regime. The third reason is that the US invaded Iraq as an act of self-defense. So, disarming Iraq of weapons of mass destruction was an act of defending the United States security and also that of the international community, because Saddam had exemplified himself as a careless leader who could abuse weapons, as he had done so in his war against the Iraq. The last reason as to why the US invaded Iraq was the US engaged in a preemptive war. Preemptive war is a war that you engage with an enemy before the enemy attacks you. So there is a dynamic of security dilemma such that there is a lot of tension between two camps, and all the signs are clear that there will be a war. Therefore, you strike first before your enemy strikes you. So, to elaborate that one further, the reason why the US chose to invade Iraq was because Iraq would collapse easily because it was defenseless. Saddam Hussein had overestimated his power, and according to the standards of US, Iraq was still a weak state. Therefore, they engaged in a preemptive war to decapitate the power of Saddam Hussein. I'm done with the reasons why they attacked Iraq. Now, I want to focus briefly on why they did not invade North Korea. One of the reasons as to why the US refrained from attacking North Korea was the US constructed North Korea as a manageable threat that could be solved through diplomacy. Remember that agreed framework of 1994. It had already stipulated that in case of a conflict between the US and North Korea, they would utilize diplomacy or negotiation. Therefore, the US constructed North Korea as a less dangerous regime compared to that of Iraq. Therefore, they assumed that they would manage that threat through negotiation. The second reason as to why the US chose not to invade North Korea was because of that agreed framework. Although North Korea, because there was a team that was dispatched by the United Nations that deals with the inspection of whether a regime has weapons of mass destruction. That agency is known as the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. So it is a team of inspectors drawn from various countries and commanded by the UN. So when that team was deployed in North Korea, the regime in Pyongyang confessed that they had violated the terms of nuclear treaty. And the regime also agreed that they were in a process of acquiring weapons of mass destruction. But now, despite their confession, why did the US refuse to invade that country? Because negotiation was the first method that the US would utilize as per the 1994 agreed framework. The third and second last reason as to why the US failed to attack North Korea was because North Korea, as I argued earlier, is closer to Japan and South Korea. And those two countries are allies of the United States. Therefore, in the event of war, North Korea would have started with attacking South Korea and Japan, and that would have jeopardized the US because of its military bases in South Korea. Also, and this is also very, very important, attacking North Korea would have drawn China and Russia into the conflict. And we all know how powerful Russia still is militarily. So drawing Russia and China would have maybe tilted the balance in favor of maybe North Korea. So that is another reason that the US refrained from attacking North Korea. The last reason, North Korea pursuit of weapons of mass destruction was constructed as a means of survival in the international system. According to realism, the US viewed North Korea as a rational actor compared to Iraq, which was an irrational actor that was pursuing weapons of mass destruction to attack other countries. Therefore, the US resolved to utilize diplomacy. And also it is important to note that despite them preferring diplomacy, President Bush had